I know, that's good. I like it.
Well, folks, thanks for sticking with us today. I always put General Formica in the cleanup position here because everybody wants to hear what he has to say. But I think it's appropriate to close out today's session with a discussion of transforming the air and missile defense capability in the Army. Another distinguished panel. I really appreciate all the speakers that are still here today. We've had a pretty high-powered group in here today, and I hope everybody's appreciated that. So with that, for the last session, I'll turn it over to my friend, Lieutenant General Dick Formica. Dick.
Thanks, Guy. Let me, on behalf of the panel, add to what you've heard so many times today, and that's our thanks first to AUSA, General Sullivan, General Swan, and the others for hosting this event, and probably just as importantly, for really focusing an Army discussion on AMD in so many forums, this just being one of them. We appreciate AUSA's ownership of that. And I wouldn't want to miss the opportunity to thank AUSA for what you do for our soldiers, civilians, and families every day. So thanks for that. As you heard throughout the day, and you all know because you're in this business, this is a critical capability that remains in high demand from the combatant commanders. The recently published report from the National Commission on the Future of the Army, which has been referred to several times already today, clearly spells this out as an area for growth in the Army. And so this panel has been asked to discuss transform the force. Now, I think the timing and the sequence was pretty thoughtful. You heard about the network, and you heard about defeating an enemy capability. You heard about building partner capacity, and now with this closing panel, we get to talk about the force that's got to execute all that today and as it transforms in the future. And to do that, AUSA has really brought together a distinguished panel. As you'll hear from their positions, we've got TRADOC and requirements experts. We're going to have a little discussion on strategy, and we got an industry perspective. So without further ado, let me introduce the panel first, and then I'll turn it over to the panel chair. To my right, the panel chair, Major General Bo Dyess, currently serving as the Deputy Director of Army Capabilities Integration Center at U.S. Army TRADOC. He's joined by the following four panel members: Brigadier General Frank Muth, currently serving as the Director of the Quadrennial Defense Review Office and Headquarters DAG-8, and soon to be building partner capacity and is the PM Saudi Arabia National Guard.
Hua.
Yeah. Mr. Robert Martinage, who's a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. Colonel retired Brian Dunn, who works at Air and Missile Defense for Lockheed Martin Missiles and Fire Control. And then Colonel Robert Kelley, Bob Kelley, who's the Capability Manager for TRADOC for Army Air and Missile Defense. And distinguished panel should bring a great perspective on this important subject of transforming the force. And so I'll turn the panel over to the chair, Major General Bo Dyess.
Thank you, General Formica and AUSA for pulling together this great panel today. Saint Barbara, the patron saint of artillery, would be pleased. Not only because the air defense artillery and the field artillery are co-located at Fort Sill, where the requirements are generated for both of those different branches, but you have a general officer with an air defense background who is now in charge of the fire center, and you don't have an air defense officer who is also a general officer, and there's a difference between those two. So when you get to the general officer level, you came from somewhere, but you are bigger than where you came from. And so I think that that is also a big plus. You've heard today about cross-domain fires. about field artillery pieces, firing things that could interject missiles or aircraft, and you've also talked about the things that we need to do on the air and missile defense side, which is the theme of this panel. There's 5 questions that I'm going to ask the audience, and I'm going to give you one answer. The first question is, should the intellectual lead the physical? And the answer to that one is yes. The second question is, how does the intellectual lead the physical? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that because that is a much more difficult problem set. How do you look at the future? And how do you determine what direction you're going to go in? The third question is, has the last fighter pilot been born? The fourth question is, when will the aircraft carrier become the battleship? The fifth question is, are we chasing the right assumptions? Or are there assumptions that we need to chase that we're not chasing? Those are generic questions about how do you think about the future. So ARCIC, the organization that I'm in, also known as Future Center at one time, we really have a construct of think, learn, analyze, and implement. So when you think, and those questions that I asked earlier they were questions that would have you think about and think clearly about the future of armed conflict. You must consider things like mission, enemy, threats, but also have to consider history and lessons learned when you're thinking about the future. We have written the Army operating concept. I know most of you, we had a AUSA 2014 talked about that. We talked about it in the 2015 AUSA conference that we had here in Washington, D.C. Win in a complex world. And up in the up front part of it, where General Perkins, straight up commander, said, look, the future is both, the totality of the future is both unknown and unknowable. But that doesn't mean that you can't think about where you are now and where you want to go and where the enemy is and where they want to go, and think about how you're going to chase the right assumptions. From the Army operating concept, we developed 20 first-order questions that the solutions to which would make the Army a better place. We call them the Army Warfighter Challenges. So in the past, difficult problems are often broken down into its components, and then they're tasked out to the different staffs or perhaps different centers of excellence. If it's a fires problem, it would probably go to Fort Sill, or air defense, it'd go to Fort Sill, or if it was a tank thing, it'd probably go maneuver to Fort Benning. But these warfighting challenges essentially say, they put the problem on the table, and you might have different people that are helping to provide the answer to them. And I'll just go through, I looked through the list here for this audience. There's probably 13 primaries, maybe more than that, and I'm going to read the ones that I picked out, but there's more. Because if you're the lead for integrating one of these warfighting challenges, you're essentially supporting on 19 others. So really, the whole Army has got pieces of all these problems, and you put the problem on the table, and then you're able to then talk about them from a different perspective. First one, shape the security environment. That's been talked about through the different panels. Adapt the institutional Army. Conduct homeland operations. Conduct space and cyber electromagnetic operations and maintain communications. Improve soldier leader and team performance. Who doesn't want to do that? Develop agile and adaptive leaders. Conduct joint expeditionary maneuver and entry operations. Wide area security. Ensure interoperability. Set the theater. Integrate fires. Deliver fires. Develop capable formations. Those things were all talked about in the panels that, in some aspect, in all the panels that were here today. whether it's in a joint ASCC, COCOM area, or it's back at Fort Sill in force design updates, or how we're going to organize, or how we're going to train, or how we're going to develop leaders. So think. And learning. We're doing a Russian New Generation Warfare study, head by the Commandant of Infantry, Pete Jones. We did a request to EUCOM that said, how many people from the U.S. Military-related have been to the Ukraine in a 12-month period? And during this 12-month period, you just have to guess how many people have been over there. 3,481 during this 12-month period that we asked. So it's like, okay, well, what are they learning? What did they see? How is that going to impact what we're going to bring to the Army as organizations? Perhaps change the doctrine? Should we change our materiel? So we're doing this study that's going to help us learn. And something that you could help us with is, what are the learning demands that we ask for folks to look at? What about experimentation? What about wargaming? What about the combatant command or ASCC exercises that were talked about? Because all of those things could be outputs that can be used to influence what our doctrine is going to be, or organization, or training, or leader material development, et cetera. On analyze, so think, learn, analyze. You really you determine, you have to make an assumption about where you are now as your base, where you want to go in the future, and we have 2025 and beyond. And the difference between where you are and where you want to go is the gap. And then you have priority gaps, high-risk gaps, and potential solutions. And so I think that's one of the things that we do at TRADOC and ARCIC, is to recommend potential solutions, both material and other aspects of the DOTML PF. On implementation, in the Think, Learn, Analyze, Implement, you've got two boxes on the how the Army runs force management model. There's two boxes way up at the top in the middle. It's TAA, Total Army Analysis, and the POM, Program Objective Memorandum. That is where the force structure is set and where the dollars are allocated in the program. And I've frequently called the POM and TAA, it's like this big conveyor belt. It's long and it's very slow, but it is predictable. And so off in different parts of the Army, there are things that are little idea generators, and they're spinning rapidly, but they're over here in the corner. And every now and then there'll be something that spins out that may connect over here. But if you don't move that rapidly spinning wheel to connect up with that low, slow, predictable conveyor belt, which is the POM and the TAA, then all you're going to do is spin over here in a wheel. So you have to connect to both the force structure and the dollars allocated in order to do something. Because if it was the right thing to do and didn't cost anything, we would most likely already be doing it. The NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, one part of it, the service chiefs were asked to be more involved in the acquisition process, and then they were now going to come back to the Congress and give a briefing or tell them how they're going to be involved in it. And only mention that from the standpoint of the requirement side, from Fort Sill or Fort Benning or Fort Rucker, that the Chief of Staff, the Vice Chief of Staff, will be much more involved in the acquisition process. The National Commission for the Future of the Army, which was frequently annotated today, a superb body of work. There is no checkbook associated with either force structure or dollars associated with this. However, that does not mean that the Army staff or TRADOC will not be taking a serious look, because this is a serious body of work, and making recommendations on how to implement these. And really, when you're talking about long-term implementation of big programs like this, you have three time periods. You have a near time period, essentially what the POM is, where President's budget for 17 was just submitted. We're getting ready. The Army staff is working right now on 18 to 22. And about 18 months from now, that may or may not be the appropriation that the Congress signs. And then Mr. Tyson was here this morning that talked about PB 17, President's Budget 17, which essentially laid out what he thought was the air and missile defense. And half of my brain is the last 3 years working as the FD inside of G8 in the Army staff. I'm well familiar with all of the recommendations that we had in there for air and missile defense, which is a pretty solid, and the field artillery as well, a pretty solid portfolio. Anyway, I'll stop there, and I think now General Formica is going to help drive some questions, and then we'll take some questions from the audience as well.
Okay, thanks, Bo. As he said, we're looking forward to hearing from you and getting your questions. But to get us started, I've got one for the panel members for each of them. I'm going to start to continue the discussion at the higher end. We'll talk a little bit about the strategy. So I'll start with General Muth. Sir, do you see a link between the strategic review of 2012, the 2014 QDR, and the report from the National Commission on the Future of the Army that General Dyess just referred to? And then could you, if you see that link, could you describe how that impacts missile defense and its role in anti-access area denial?
Thank you, sir. It's a good question.
Yeah.
Excellent. I wonder who came up with that. No. All right. So first of all, again, thank you very much. It's always good to get out of the building. Everybody knows that. And it's always a pleasure to come over here in this great venue with, phenomenal folks in the audience to be able to have a discussion, certainly a strategic dialogue about, the topics that we're talking about, ballistic missile defense, but also strategy. And some of my background has to do with resourcing as the former director of material and now the QDR office. But, and then going to Saudi this summer, again, kind of getting out of the building and being the PM sang. Great opportunities. But, I think the best way to answer this is we've got to go back in time because, why are we here today? Why are we here dealing with some of the difficulties with both our strategy, or let's call them challenges, and also with the results on the 28th of January at 1400 when they released online the National Commission for the Future of the Army. It starts in 2011 with the Budget Control Act. Let's face it. It started with sequestration. And I was the FDD down in the Dom dealing with tanks, Brads, and Strykers in the ground combat vehicle at the time when we started to deal with that. And so what I saw there was, and then as the Dom the next year, is a budget for the Army at the time, which was projected at the time we were projecting through 5 years, of course. So basically last year it was projected to be up to about $137 billion based on requirements. It was 121 and change. And I know the president's budget went in, I think at like 126 with some add-ons, but essentially there was a huge drop. And that's a lot to take out. Meanwhile, at the same time, we were dealing with our the manning challenges. Now, what did that mean to our modernization budget? It meant essentially, as the Dom and myself and my boss, when we were overseeing it together for that first year, really dealing with the full effects of sequestration, was the modernization account, or the EEPEG, went from $27 billion to $20 billion. Because where else can you get money to pay for the bills that we had at the time? And it all comes out of the hardware account. Because you can't take down manning fast enough, and at the time we were at about 560,000. We knew we were going to end up having to go, because of the strategic review in 2012, which I'll get to in a second, down to potentially 490, and then ultimately we're going to 450. We didn't know it then, but we knew we were coming down. You can't take manning out fast enough to be able to pay for the bills. It all came out of hardware. All right? So next year, the following year in 2012, we do the strategic review. Why? Because we're trying to find a balance between what strategy was requiring us to do, knowing what the national military strategy, national security strategy, national defense strategy, everything we're doing. We're coming up on a QDR, and we're trying to figure out a balance. All right? So we know for a fact the resources are going down. We're paying these huge bills, and we're also having to deal with a strategy. So national security, or the strategic review, occurs in 2012. What comes out of that? Well, essentially, we are getting looked at manning-wise for the Army at 380 to 420. I think most of you guys, everybody knew that coming out of 2012 strategic review. That was what was going to happen. Active component. If full sequestration was going to hit. And again, you can't take that amount of manning out fast enough. So again, where do? You go to where the money is, and it's in the hardware. And this gets back to ballistic missile defense and ultimately what the commission came out with, which was we're not putting enough money into modernization, or we need to increase our investment into modernization. Followed by the 2012 strategic review, then we start working on the QDR. QDR comes out, And essentially, it identifies, again, QDR, for anybody who doesn't know, I know it's very simple, but you take your strategy and you take your resources, and it goes into a mixer, and you're making sausage, and you're trying to balance the both to come out with the best strategy to meet the national security requirements. And basically, it comes out and it says, it's a disrupt and defeat requirement. It's identifying China, Korea, Iran, and Russia. And again, trying to balance the strategy and the resources. So what occurs as this is coming out in June, what occurs in April of 2014? Russia goes into Crimea. What happens that summer? As it's being released, Russia goes into the Ukraine. What also starts to occur summer of 2014? ISIL and its move through both Syria and into Iraq. We're back in Iraq. We're not leaving Afghanistan. We're dealing with the Russian resurgence, both not just what they're doing in Crimea and the Ukraine, but their SNAP exercises occurring along the Baltics and the potential threat to Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, everything that's going on in Europe and the requirement to stay in there. All of this, you can wrap it up into velocity of global instability, now takes many assumptions that we had for both balancing the resources of the resources and the strategy to come up with the best solution, and it now puts it, even though we've had a plan, it came out and it was almost disrupted within 6 months. So we're trying to find the right balance, and then we go in, and then the NDA comes out in the December of 14, and it says National Commission for the Future of the Army, because many of the decisions that were made to help try to find that balance within the Army, ARI being one of them, Aviation Restructure Initiative, to try to save that money, it was putting a lot of strain across the Army. So National Commission of the Future of the Army was to look overall what we're doing and what is what we're going to do into the future. So what did they come out with? Essentially, they came out with, we have been paying and mortgaging everything to do with our strategy for the last couple years, and it's coming out of the modernization account. And so they've talked about looking back into the SHORAD, many of the enablers, back into aviation. And I think this gets also to ballistic missile defense, which is, the National Commission, 63 recommendations. They're going forward. There's a chunk that is for that is outside the Army's purview, whether it's with the President or with Congress or potentially with OSD in terms of policy. Then there is a chunk that are at the decision level of the Secretary and the Chief. And they've got to move forward with this. But again, it's trying to find that balance of what the Commission has now come out with about what our budget is, and there's no top-line ad, just like General Formica said. With the National Commission, there was no top-line ad. It says you've got to, you should and you could, or you should and you should consider these following items, and again, there's 63. But again, there's no top-line ad. So if Congress or if there is not more money put into the Army account, then there's got to be trades within. And again, it's trades to determine a balance between what's the requirement on the Army right now, okay, knowing that we're going to 450, knowing what our modernization account looks like, and trying to fulfill the national security strategy that we are required to fulfill with the velocity of global instability. We're back in Iraq. We're still in Afghanistan. We're back in Europe, and everything else that's going on, and of course Korea acting up, doing the missile launch yesterday with the satellite, or 2 days ago. So I say that what's the thread? It's constantly trying to find the right balance between our resources, which are never predictable, especially with the budgetary process, and also with meeting our requirements of the strategy and then the demand signal that's out there with the COCOM commanders. I look forward to your questions.
Okay, thanks, Frank. So given all that, and we've had a lot of this discussion today, we're hoping that Mr. Martinage, I hope I keep pronouncing that right.
That's right. You got it.
All right, I'm gonna keep working on it. We'll put this a little bit in focus by answering this question. So given the maturation and proliferation of anti-access area denial threats, what do you see from your vantage point as the greatest challenges and opportunities for Army air and missile defense forces?
Great question. I think looking out over the next decade, emerging A2, AD challenges and the proliferation of surveillance and precision strike capabilities more broadly will pose 4 major challenges for Army air and missile defense forces. First, the assumption since really the end of the Cold War that the Army and the Joint Force more broadly can rely upon the Air Force to rapidly gain and maintain air superiority may no longer hold in many places around the world. The implication of that is that the Army will need significantly more air and missile defense capacity. and it's drawn down significantly, as everyone here knows, since the Gulf War. Question and the challenge really is how to achieve that in an affordable way, given the downward pressures on the budget, and has been discussed earlier today, a somewhat unfavorable cost exchange ratio between the interceptors we shoot and then many of the missiles that are coming in. Second, it'd be increasingly difficult to insert relatively heavy air and missile defense forces in the opening stages of a conflict through fixed airfields and ports that will be at risk. The major implication of that is this reality that air and missile defense forces are increasingly going to need to be pre-positioned or forward deployed in peacetime, which creates new pressures on the force. Third, fixed infrastructure and high signature, difficult to move units, including Patriot and THAAD batteries, will become targets for increasingly ubiquitous, relatively short-range guided rockets, artillery, mortars, and missiles, so-called GRAM threats. To protect high-demand, low-density assets like Patriot and THAAD and other high-value targets on the battlefield, it will become increasingly important to defend them with co-located, short-range, high-volume counter-GRAM defenses like powder guns and electromagnetic railguns, and there are some other opportunities on the horizon. Fourth, the use of the radio frequency spectrum for sensing, precision navigation and geolocation and communications are likely to be increasingly disrupted with more advanced jammers, radio frequency weapons like high-power microwave, and also just direct attacks with anti-radiation homing weapons. So AMD units in the future will need to be equipped and trained to operate in an increasingly contested RF environment. Okay, so that's the bad news, or at least the challenges facing the AMD force. I think there are also several opportunities as well. 5 come to mind. First, as alluded to above, the AMD mission will almost certainly expand to include a defense against GRAM threats, as well as enemy PGMs and potentially large numbers of UAVs of varying sizes and altitude regimes. And that requirement, combined with the likelihood that the Air Force may not be able to rapidly generate air superiority, means that the Air and Missile Defense Force is going to need to grow. And I think that's an opportunity. And it will need to grow not only to defend fixed points on the battlefield, ports, airfields, C3 nodes, some difficult to move units, but also increasingly maneuver units, with the assumption that the Air Force just isn't going to be there to provide air superiority. Second, technological advances may soon usher in novel, high-volume air and missile defense capabilities. I already mentioned powder guns and electromagnetic railguns with new hypervelocity projectiles. I think in addition to that, we see mobile high-energy lasers in the 100 to 200 kilowatt class that are effective against GRAM threats, as well as air-breathing threats like cruise missiles and UAVs that are really now close at hand to be fielded. It's not just something that we may see sometime in our lifetime, but really in the very near future. Third, advances in data processing, networking, and automation may not only make tactical C3 networks more resilient in the face of radio frequency jamming threats and cyber, but also dramatically improve threat detection, tracking, and fire control, as well as enhance air and missile defense battle management. Fourth, I think we're likely to see over the next decade or two the rebirth of passive defenses, which came up, both in terms of decoys and hardening. And there's some good news here, especially on the hardening side. Technology has come a long way since we last built hardened shelters sort of during the Cold War. And DARPA and the Air Force and others have multiple projects underway looking at new materials, new designs, that we can have affordable, effective shelters that may help with the survivability of the force and force protection. And fifth, as was just mentioned in the last session, is this the prospect of cross-domain ground-based fires. We've talked about air and missile defense. I think there's growing room potentially for surface-to-surface fires at growing ranges. INF will become an issue at some point, most likely. But then also looking at even counter-sea capabilities, coastal anti-ship capabilities as well, broadly speaking. So that's what I have, and look forward to your questions.
Okay, great. Thank you. Excuse me. I'd like to now ask a question from an industry perspective, and then we're going to get to the Trade-Out Capabilities Manager to bring all this together in terms of how we're transforming the force. and we've got a couple of your questions. But first to Brian Dunn, from an industry perspective, you've heard the discussion of the transformation that's going on in air defense, the need to grow, and the different systems that we're investing in. But in this area, or in this time of constrained resources and increased demand for air defense and air missile defense forces, how can industry specifically help the Army in developing the kind of needed capabilities to maintain overmatch against the threats we heard about earlier today?
Thank you, sir. I'm looking forward to that answer.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you're going to give it.
General Sullivan, General Swan, thank you so much on behalf of Lockheed Martin for the opportunity to participate in this symposium, to be part of this panel, and in the audience for all of those non-panel members who truly appreciate your perseverance for staying out this late today. Obviously, sound judgment, as this will be the most dynamic of the speaking engagements here for this symposium. So from an industry perspective, actually, from an old Army adage, we used to say that in order to be efficient and effective, you got to make your boss's job easy. And so from an industry perspective, our boss in this case is the Army. So it's industry's challenge to determine the most efficient way that the Army air and missile defense can transform. And we take our guidance from the tower just like anybody else, and the priorities that have been established for us have been pretty well laid out. First and foremost, you got to support the current warfight. So that goes to the sustainment of our current operations, sustainment to the equipment that's out there. That's a priority that we all understand pretty clearly. The second priority is to enable the Army air and missile defense to transform to an Army integrated air and missile defense architecture. And in most of industry, we think of Army integrated air and missile defense as being synonymous to Army AMD transformation. So what can we do to help enable the Army achieve its integrated air and missile defense architecture? And so beyond the execution of our current programs of record and our S&T activities, execution to cost and schedule, comes into play, what does industry do for strategic investments in order to help enable this integrated air and missile defense? And the third aspect of what we look at in industry is how do we enable the Army to achieve overmatch? And this has been an area that we've talked quite a lot about today, and General Rossi showed a pretty decent slide about what the threat looks like and how it's impacting operations. And what's interesting is a few years ago, we in air defense were using the term fairly frequently, the emerging threats. Well, those threats have emerged. They're here today, and they're demonstrating themselves with lethal effects. And the idea that we had a few years ago of being able to develop the ability to defeat the complex integrated attack, that complex integrated attack is here today. It's not a threat of 2025. It's only going to get worse in 2025. A lot of what we're seeing with the maturation of the threats is that they're developing capabilities specifically designed to defeat the systems that we have in the field today and some of the systems that we are looking at putting in the field. And that's problematic. So it goes back to what is industry going to do to make strategic level investments to, one, enable the Army integrated air and missile defense, and two, help achieve overmatch. And the two activities should truly be mutually supportive and not mutually exclusive of one another. So what we need to do within industry is we need to be tied pretty closely, not only to our acquisition partners, but really to the Army and to the requirements, because what we do with our strategic investments, and for industry partners out there, this is something that we talk quite a lot about. We do predictive analysis, because in order for us to make a significant investment in a capability or an enabler for Army integrated air and missile defense to achieve overmatch, there has to be some level of understanding as to how that requirement is going to grow over time, and then what the funding is going to look like. But beyond that, because those are the funding piece, as we've discussed here, is something that is somewhat beyond our control, and the requirements, well, they emerge over time as a result of changes in the operational environment. But we have to go back and also look at some of the guidance that we've received here from General Mann, for instance, which is, as we look at trying to achieve overmatch, as we look at how do we achieve an integrated air and missile defense, we also have to look at how do I take our current capabilities and make improvements on them to make them more efficient and more combat capable. This is not necessarily tied to some of the more glamorous new starts that are out there, such as a next generation radar, but what improvements can be made to current capabilities in order for that to better enable the integrated air and missile defense, making seekers capable of talking on multiple frequency bands, as an example. As an example that was listed here on some of the challenges, we have to look at how do we make our equipment more expeditionary, because for us who have an air defense background, we know that we ain't expeditionary. It takes us quite a long time to get to where we're going, and that's not going to be sufficient to meet the warfighting requirements here in the future. We look at what is the purpose of Army Air and Missile Defense, integrated air and missile defense, and the fact that we're moving now to a common fire control network and a common mission command platform to integrate all of our sensors and shooters is outstanding. It's absolutely the right path, and for us air defense guys, it can't happen soon enough. So the challenge comes back to us, so what additional enablers out there are required in order to achieve the aspirational goal of this integrated air and missile defense? What can we do to enable the defeat of this complex integrated attack of multiple salvos of rocket artillery and mortars, many of them precision guided, impacting near simultaneously from multiple azimuths, coupled with ISR assets of UAVs and the use of cruise missiles. That complex integrated attack exists today. So what can we do as an enabler to help achieve the ability to reach a 360-degree surveillance and fire control on our integrated air and missile defense architecture? Those are some of the strategic investments that we need to look at, because again, the emerging threat is not a 2025 problem. It's a problem today, and it's only going to get worse. So it's a challenge for us right now to determine what those investments are going to be, working closely with the Army to help articulate better what we believe is within the realm of possible in the future, and just working closely as a team is the way we need to go forward. And I will end there and wait for questions.
Thank you, Brian. Last question for our panel for me before I start again with some of the ones that have come in. We got Colonel Bob Kelley here, Trade-Out Capability Manager. Got an opportunity to tie this together a little bit for us. We've talked about the AMD strategy and the Waypoint 1. We've addressed a lot of the material development efforts over the course of the day today. But we've also heard a lot about soldiers and understand that this is more than just material development and modernization. So, Bob, could you tell us from your perspective just what are the essential elements of AMD transformation, and why is that transformation important?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Well, material development is certainly important, and it tends to get a lot of attention at forums such as this. But material development is really only one of many supporting efforts to AMD transformation writ large. The operational environment described in the Army operating concept presents significant challenges to the AMD force that we have on the battlefield today. And we've talked about these throughout the day, but the reemergence of peer or near-peer threats with advanced capabilities that contest our overmatch. Proliferation of technologies and weapons of mass destruction, missile, UAS, precision guidance, and both electronic and cyber attack. Enemy tactics intended to overwhelm and rapidly deplete our AMD resources, and the realities of the fiscal environment. To prevail in this operating environment, we must effect change in our AMD force for 2025. And we need an AMD force that is expeditionary, that's characterized by the tenets and competencies of the Army operating concept, and that serves as a critical enabler for successful joint combined arms operations. That AMD force of 2025 needs to exhibit depth and versatility with the ability to rapidly task organize force packages and seamlessly integrate. Possess flexibility and agility to remain effective and responsive against the variety of aerial threats we've talked about today. It needs to be lethal but discriminate. And perhaps most importantly, it needs to be led by leaders that are adaptive, innovative, and willing to accept prudent risk. Now, if we were to simply take the current modernization efforts that we have and field them to units with the same organizational design of today, manned with the same personnel and trained in the same manner, following the same doctrine, we will not have the force we need in 2025. We'll instead have today's force with a lot better computer screens. And that's why the FCOE has been investing tremendous intellectual capital in a holistic .mil-PF approach to AMD transformation. IBCS does serve as a critical enabler to this effort by providing that common mission command you've heard about and common fire control system across all 88 platforms and at all echelons. And really, the .mil-PF implications of that can be difficult to get your arms around. So with the assistance of some outside organizations to the FCOE and our own battle lab there, we're developing mutually supportive .mil-PF change implementation plans across all of our domains to help transform the AMD force into that force that we need in 2025. With the assistance of a RAND and a group of retired senior air defense leaders, they're helping us to understand the roles, the missions, and employment considerations for an air defense force in 2025 in that operating environment. Those insights are guiding efforts to address our warfighting challenges and further refine our doctrinal concepts. And we're beginning now to experiment with those concepts in our Fires Battle Lab. Our Fires Battle Lab is also experimenting with organizational design concepts to explore how we can best provide a tailorable, scalable capability to the Joint Force Commander and enhance our expeditionary nature of our force. The Air Defense Commandant has partnered with the Army Research Institute and Army Research Lab to maximize personnel readiness and combat effectiveness through advances in behavioral and social sciences in the human dimension focused on training and leader development. Their findings in areas of front-end analysis strategies for complex systems, decision-making under uncertainty, and enhancing the ability to train complex cognitive skills are today being incorporated into our branch's training and professional military education. As Brigadier General Sheriff mentioned earlier, the Air Defense Branch is also looking hard at our military occupational specialties and transitioning from a system-centric approach to a more functionally based approach. Instead of developing Patriot operators and Avenger gunners, in the future, we want to grow experts in air battle management, air defense launchers, and air defense radars. This new MOS structure will streamline training and add flexibility to our force management. So this is an exciting time for the Army Air Defense. We are on the verge of fielding multiple AMD material solutions to our formations over the next decade. But more importantly, the changes that we are making in the manner in which we organize, man, train, and employ those forces will fundamentally change the character of our force and better enable joint combined arms operations, which truly is really the essence of AMD transformation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Bob. Okay, we'll just start taking some questions from the audience, and Chairman and I were just talking about time. We got about 25 minutes, so we've got some time left, and we're going to take advantage of it and get some of this good assessment from the panel. The first question comes in. We've heard discussions, General Rossi, I think, first mentioned it, and a couple of the panel members, I think both General Dyess and Mr. Martinage, have both referred to cross-domain fires. So this question asks, could you expand on the potential for those cross-domain fires in order to get an increased use out of existing Army artillery? I'm going to start, Bob, with you if you want to take that, and Colonel Kelley, you'll be next. We'll start with Mr. Martinage and then Colonel Kelley, and then anybody else in the panel might want to add to that.
I think the opportunity with cross-domain fires is fundamentally to create anti-access area denial challenges for our adversaries. Causes us fits, just turn the tables on them. So, and ground-based fires can be a big part of that. So there's the counter-air piece, the counter-missile piece, but then taking further advantage of surface-to-surface fires, precision fires, and like I said, increasingly in some of these areas, we may want to look at increased range, which will mean that INF needs to be looked at. And then going into the maritime domain, I think there is space for looking at ground-based fires, both for anti-ship and potentially even anti-submarine warfare in the future. And if you look at some places, like the Western Pacific and the First Island chain, the archipelago of islands, has very, very favorable geography for doing that type of cross-domain operations with ground-based fires by taking advantage of that geography.
Okay, Colonel Kelley, did you want to?
Sir, I would echo that. I would say that there's a lot of interest in a cross-domain solution for that. Essentially, our adversaries are building A2AD capabilities that really present some challenges for us that a cross-domain solution can solve. And from my office and the other TRADOC capability managers at Fort Sill, we're participating in a good number of studies to look at how to go about doing that and what we would need to be able to enable that, both from a material and a policy perspective.
Okay.
And I'd just like to add that everything works in the lab and on the floor at AUSA. So it's like, show me that we've got this capability. It's got to be demonstrated. And I think that we're getting to the point where we can actually demonstrate some of these capabilities, but it's on the early edge of it yet. So there's still lots of work to be done. But I think the question was, what's the potential? I think there's great potential here for cross-domain fires.
Okay, before we leave that subject, because I just got a question in that relates to it, is anybody here aware of a specific plan that would demonstrate cross-domain fires in some program of experimentation? Is that on the books yet? Okay, silence is golden.
I'll just say that the SecDef yesterday or this week talked about several things that are in the work, and I that's about all I want to say on that is what the Secretary of Defense had indicated in some of his press releases.
Okay. This question starts with an assessment that says the Army doesn't always do a sufficient job in publicizing its role in the Joint Force Air and Missile Defense Capability Area. We don't do that inside the Army necessarily. We don't always do it with outside audiences. So the question, and I'm going to start, General Dyess, with you and then others that might want to add in, what can be done to get the Army more credit or visibility in the capabilities that it delivers in the Joint Force?
I'd start out by saying we're probably a victim of our own success. So when's the last time we shot down aircraft? I'm sure that somebody's got the data that shows when we actually shot down an aircraft or missile. But we've been shooting things down out of the air in this current fight. And I think that we have an opportunity, both as threats present themselves with movement of air and missile defense farther in the Pacific, as well as being able to say that we've actually saved lives in Iraq and Afghanistan by the use of CRAM and those type of capabilities. So I think that we have an opportunity to be able to say, hey, look, we are an important part. Now, the air and missile defense is an important part of the Army. And quite frankly, is things like this that could help, because I see Sydney, I see you back in the back there. You're just blogging away as we talk, like usual. And so this is just a great opportunity. You invite folks here that are both bloggers as well as article writers and opinion shapers. And so thank you to AUSA for allowing us this opportunity to do that.
I can chime in too.
And for attribution.
I just pile on in one way in terms of the A2AD challenge. The anti-access, a big part of that is base denial. And you're thinking about how do we deal with that in the future. It's kind of a combination of access to more bases, dispersion, hardening, and resiliency of bases. But a key part is active defense. And so in terms of enabling the joint force, the Air Force, Navy, Marine Corps, to defend those bases that are increasingly under threat from a range of ballistic and cruise missiles, for example, in the Pacific, as well as air power, that's a big enabler for the joint force that's just going to be increase in value over time.
Yeah, but I would just say it gets to, the message that you're trying to convey, that's great, but it gets down to deterrence and how do you prove a negative? Because you're out there as a deterrence, ballistic missile defense, and until it's tested, and not that we wanted that to happen, but it's very hard to go back and go to different agencies or elements for money or for more modernization when you can't really say, okay, it's proving that negative, and it's very difficult, and you're just constantly having to beat the drum and get the message out there.
And it's actually both the deterrence and assurance, and both of those seem to be working. Comment from the audience.
No, I was just,
CGA JCB is next week, chaired by Lieutenant General Ayardi, and you welcome this conversation.
Okay, great. Bob, did you want to add something
no,
else?
I was just going to say that I think you're going to see just increasing demand in several AORs, but certainly PACOM for more active, missile defense because of the threat. And you look at what we have there now, and I think everyone would say it's not what we need. I mean, and just look at the bases we have and how vulnerable they are, and I think it's we have to address that.
I think that kind of leads into the next question, and I'm going to start with General Muth and then Mr. Martinage, if you want to add from a think tank perspective. As we look to the prospect of a new administration coming in a year, is there any expectation that there might be another ballistic missile defense review coincident to the next QDR? And then I would add, if we don't know, do we think there ought to be?
All right, I'll say right now, I've heard no discussion about that at all. I do know, internally, we're looking forward in terms of setting up the mechanisms to be able to support the QDR 2018. But I just don't see anything right now, and I don't, at least from the Army's perspective, I think, in my personal, I'll just call it my personal opinion. I think we need to work through the National Commission for the Future of the Army and how that impacts us as a service before we would go and sign up for anything else in terms of review of any strategic nature or strategic review. Because it does, those 63 recommendations, whether it's in the purview of the Army to make the decision or it's outside, will have an impact on both, again, potential on both our strategic depth, on our modernization, and our potential manning levels.
I don't have anything to add to that. I think it's
Okay.
I would just say that there's art and science. I mean, you do not want to be in a position where you are surprised in the future. And so it gets back to that point about what assumptions are we chasing, or which assumptions are we not chasing that we should be chasing. And so you don't want to do the backwards investigation to determine that today was the proximate cause of some event that occurs in the future. And it is really the essence of what the folks on the centers do in relationship to the Army staff. What is risk, how much risk, and then what resources do you put against what solutions to put into the pipeline?
Here's a question. I'll start with some combination of Colonel Kelley and General Dyess, and then again, if any other panel members want to chime in. We've had a lot of discussion today about electronic attack and cyber and directed energy. And so this question gets after how do you integrate those capabilities, electronic attack, cyber attack, into a future AMD mission, and how much of that capability ought to reside in the AMD force?
I'll start. Really, it is some of those things are in the warfighting challenges, and when we had a warfighting challenge, for example, we were looking at some things that were occurring in the Ukraine that really was there was part of the solution came from Fire Center, part of the solution came from Cyber Center, part of the solution came from Aviation Center, and part of the solution came from the Maneuver Center at Fort Benning. And so I think the way to get after it is I don't think it's necessarily part of the solution will be from the Fire Center and the AMD community, and part of it will be from other parts of the Army or perhaps even the Joint Staff. So I think how to get after it is you put the warfighting challenge on the table, and then you say, hey, what learning demands do we have against it? And then you say, what are the gaps? And then the potential solutions. That's what. And then if it's high enough in a risk category, then you go into the Army leadership and say, look, this is something that we need to invest in order to close this gap because the overmatch is we're being overmatched, or this is something new that we have not seen before that is a gap that has not existed. That's the way we would approach it, sir.
Sir, I'd just add that, today we talk about electronic and cyber attacks in the context of the AMD just because of the nature of this forum that we're in today. But that's really an Army-wide problem. Electronic attack affects all our communication systems, all of our sensors throughout the battlefield. And cyber attack really affects everything. As we talk about going to a networked mission command, we talked a lot about cyber on that panel here today. So from an air defense side, we're focused on really two things. One, making our systems more resilient. We heard talk about improving systems that are out there on the battlefield, more resistant to those types of attacks, but also contributing to the Army-wide effort that is really across all the COEs for how do we get after that across the Army.
So I'll just pile on that. I mean, I think that the electronic attack, radio frequency warfare, directed energy, it's also an opportunity for the Air and Missile Defense Force. So thinking about high-power microwave weapons that could, essentially protect a wide area against UAV swarms or other, small submunitions. So you're not engaging individual things, but actually anything that is in the envelope of that high-power microwave could be disrupted. So, the flip side of adversaries getting precision strike or precision guided weapons is that then they become vulnerable to these types of attack. And I think the same thing is true for high-energy laser, which is, a DE thing that, potentially a very, very deep magazine, low cost per shot for going after these UASs and, some PGMs and cruise missiles. So it's both a threat and an opportunity.
Anybody else? I think this question, I'm not so sure if I paid attention right, may have been asked to each of the other three panels. So somebody's persistent if I'm right. But I'll put it out there if anybody knows the answer or wants to give a different answer than we've heard before. Is a radar competition for the Integrated Air and Missile Defense System funded in FY17 as previously planned, or has it been pushed into FY18 or beyond? Anybody know that?
No idea.
I think we've heard that question.
No idea.
Maybe not. Okay, we've got about 5 minutes left, and so I want to throw a question out to the panel. As I have often thought about the direction of where we're going to take the AMD force, I often talk about it in terms of a variety of tensions. And one of the tensions is the tension between capability and capacity. As you transform the AMD force, or as you look to the future of the AMD force, do you improve the capability of what you have and get new capabilities, or do you just increase the capacity of what you already have? And how do you think your way through how you want to balance that? Anybody want to take that on?
I know we've been talking about both capability and capacity, and there is an argument for capacity if you want to have a robust force, if you want to have a force that can endure, that can consolidate gains, you've got to have the capacity. You've got to have the capability as well. So I think in this case, the National Commission on the Future of the Army actually did make recommendations on both primarily the capacity, but also on the capability. And so I think, like Frank said, we've got to take a look inside of the Army about which ones of these are we going to take on. And then, as you know, in a bill-paying type of situation, you've got to come up with the bill payers. If you're zero-sum gain, then you've got to come up with the bill payers and what is going to be laid on the table for bill paying in order to do which ones of these and then how much.
There's we've heard it before, but there's capability and capacity in itself. And when you have that the velocity of global instability that I talked about, and we're being pulled in so many different directions, and many elements that we have, especially in our enablers, are back to almost 1 to a 1.2 dwell. That's where you got to come out with that balance, because you have to constantly pursue the capability. Even in the resource-constrained time, and I'll give you the example of post-Vietnam. Had we not continued funding in R&D and in research and development in the M1, the Bradley, the Black Hawk, and the Apache, where would it have been in Desert Storm? But somebody kept going, and they kept keeping money going towards that, even in the lowest budgetary times. And so we've got to keep going after that capability, yet we've got to keep an eye on the capacity and find that balance, because we're still being drawn in multiple ways. And that doesn't seem to be is going to stop. And if you take that the extreme violent organizations is now a condition, and if you understand what that means, that is a constant that we'll always be dealing with, regardless of the spikes and other strategic draws across our force. That is always going to be there right now, and that's been stated. That's a condition. So we've got to make sure that we're always able to meet that requirement and then be able to spike when required or surge.
So my 2 cents on that is that in terms of the challenge, it's increasing in complexity and the scale of the threat is increasing too. So question 1 is, how can you reduce the threat in other ways? So can we operate differently so we're not under as dense the threat arcs as we currently are? Can we take more advantage of passive defenses? And then 2, obviously we need the capability to deal effectively with the threats, whatever they are. And then lastly, it gets to the capacity issue. But I think we've got to be careful on the capacity issue that it doesn't become a cost-imposing strategy against us, which means we really need to reverse the current cost exchange ratio between missile interceptors and incoming missiles, especially at the shorter ranges, because we're just going to get crushed by numbers. And that's why I think we need to look at things like the hypervelocity projectiles and other things.
Okay, thank you. We're at the end of our time. Before I close it out, let me just go down. Anybody have anything on their mind they want to say? Last thoughts? Chairman?
I'd just like to say that I've been this close to General Formica many times, and it hadn't always come out well for me. So I am very appreciative of his moderation of the panel today. And, sir, your leadership continues to show even in the retired ranks from the side. So thank you very much.
Thanks. Let me just wrap up with 2 final thoughts. One is to echo what we've heard throughout the day and that I started off with. Thanks to AUSA for hosting this panel and for this forum. I think it's been a great conversation on the current state and future of air and missile defense, a capability area that we know is going to continue to grow. And even if it means trades somewhere else in the Army has invested in this capability. It needs to continue to do so. And we appreciate the discussion. Finally, I want to end with every forum like this that I participate in, I always remind us that most of our discussion tends to be about technology and these high advanced systems that provide air and missile defense. And it's always good to be reminded that the most critical missile defense, air and missile defense capability that our nation has are the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and civilians who develop, deploy, and operate those systems. And it's for them that we have forums like this. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's give him a hand.
Thank you.
Couldn't have said it better myself, Dick. Thank you very much. Hey, folks, before we close, this question comes up in all of our events. How can industry help? Well, let me just say that your participation in these events is a way to help. We try at AUSA to level the playing field. You don't see, I don't know if there are any JAGs here or any general counsels. We try to make this as user-friendly for our industry partners as well as professional development for our military personnel. So how you can help is by attending these events. As General Sullivan mentioned this morning, this is the second of 9 of these deep dive one-day events that we'll be doing this year. The next one will be at the end of March on installation management. But before that, a couple of other events coming up. Obviously, the big Global Force Symposium in Huntsville. Probably 2/3 to 3/4 of this crowd will be in Huntsville for that one. In April, we'll be participating with many of you in Malaysia at DSA 2016. In May, SOFEX in Amman, Jordan, and then some of you will be in Paris in June for Eurosatory. A reminder, this year's annual meeting in October is actually a week earlier this year. You know, we're always connected with the Columbus Day weekend. It's actually going to be a week earlier, 3 to 5 October this year for your calendars. Again, on behalf of all of us, General Sullivan, the whole team at AUSA, thanks for your participation. We'll see you in Huntsville. Thank you.